Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eddie Mandry, and I serve as Director for Africa at Yale University, and it's a distinct honor and pleasure to be here as your moderator for this very important but concluding session on employment and entrepreneurship in Sub-Saharan Africa. We have with us here in this room people who are working tirelessly to effect change in specific domains and areas that will eventually impact the young people of this great continent of ours. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge some of our sponsors for this session, Thomson Reuters, as well as the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And we're also quite honored to have with us here at this session today, His Excellency Obasanjo, who's a member of the Leadership Council of Concordia. Thank you very much for joining us in this very important conversation. So to kick us off, I'd like to call on somebody who maintains a particular bird's eye view in terms of their engagement on some of the questions dealing with development and transformation on the continent, and that would be Mamadou with the Rockefeller Foundation. And would it be possible for you to just, from your vantage point, try and give us a sense of what you see taking shape? What is the status at the moment in terms of the challenges or the opportunities that you encounter as you work at the nexus of very many different sectors, health, agriculture, economy, and so on, with the foundation?
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Let me first say that I look at the continent first as an African, but in my day-to-day job as the representative of the Rockefeller Foundation and philanthropy in general, I look at areas where we can actually be strategically helpful. And I want to say that actually we as philanthropy are in no way a substitute to government and or what government can do in terms of owning, planning, guiding, coordinating the actors to go and achieve their development agenda. So one of the things that recently a few months back, about 5 months, I gathered a number of African thought leaders to really think about where and we see actually an opportunity to sort of support strategically African development and achieve real impact. And one of the things that came very most frequently is around the state capacity actually to deliver. So this is one thing that I think that is absolutely very important, regardless of the sector we are talking about. And it is a place where actually many of actors like us are kind of feeling some of the challenge. We talk a lot about the need to fund and finance many activities, but many areas. But one of the challenges we see is really the execution. So I think that all of this comes down to the topic that we'll be talking about later, which is youth employment and all of that. So how can we actually reinforce and build the human capital in Africa, not just the youth, but also today the people who are in charge of really delivering the people, for the services for the people, so that they can actually do that in the most effective way possible. So that's one of the observations. I think that it is what I would like to share.
Thank you very much, Mamadou. And you highlight a very important point on the role of government in being an integral part of the equation in trying to resolve this challenge. 3 million jobs being created annually on the continent, 668 universities across Africa are churning out 10 million eager graduates looking for opportunities, looking for jobs, and they can't seem to find them. What are some of the things that you're seeing needs to happen or shift in changing this dynamic? There's many young people who are struggling to find work, and I know there's a couple of people here who are innovating in that space. I know Olumide with TWIM Academy. Would you like to maybe speak a little bit to what you're trying to do to address this challenge?
Okay, thank you for having me here. To start with, about 6 years ago, in 2012, I left Nigeria for India. I went for vocational education. I was interested in movie post-production. And before leaving, I graduated with a degree in agricultural economics. And before that, I was in the Department of Mathematical Sciences. So you would wonder why I would have such a seemingly confused educational career. So for me, getting to India, I got to discover that I was very creative and I wanted to be a creative. But there had been a lot of societal pressure for courses like engineering and things in the sciences. And so looking at the landscape in India, looking at the dynamics of that environment, I discovered that they had a very similar population. Now they're about 1.3 billion. We in Africa are about 1.2 billion. I saw that they also had some examples of extreme poverty, just like Africa, and some places that were thriving as well. And they also had a very strong youth population. So I started asking myself that why would we not be able to innovate in the creative industries like they were doing, because they have a much stronger creative hub. And it's not just the creative industry, even in technology. And by the time I looked at that, I saw that our educational structures needed to be adjusted. And so I went back to Nigeria and founded TWIM Academy, which I registered as a vocational school. But I encountered a number of problems almost immediately after. The society has been structured around university education. And that's a very big problem, because people are not thinking about the skills that they can use and immediately get employed. So by doing that at TWIM Academy, I've been able to show people how to use their skills, how to use their creativity, and how to turn that into employment opportunities. And it's a model that works. We've seen a lot of results along that way. I think that one very important point to note is that the young people of Africa are incredibly talented. I think we must, the young people of Africa have a lot of potential, and much of that potential is bottled up because there are structures that have not really allowed people to unleash themselves. So we're beginning to see a situation where, thanks to the internet, young people are beginning to come out. And we're seeing some creativity here and there, and we're seeing new structures that are changing the dynamics. But I really think that so that we don't have a problem on our hands in the future, we need to do some more, especially in that vocational sector.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Olumide, for your input on kind of the experience you've had with TWIM Academy and the insights you've integrated from your time in India. There's a sense, and you allude to it, that our universities might be under-preparing or focusing on on developing the wrong set of skills for the young people who are coming into the workforce. And I'm sure there's some of you here who've probably had challenges trying to identify talent that can be integrated into your companies. But is there an issue with the educational systems and the paradigms, the pedagogy, the practice that exists in African universities at the moment with regard to what needs to happen? And I'll leave it. I'll throw the question to the floor, so just press the button if you'd like to comment on this question of education for young, talented Africans that can focus on
Yeah. Okay. I would say that the access to education is abysmal. Unless you're very wealthy in many African countries, the price for a private school education is very similar to the price of a private school to the price of a private school education here in America. Two of my brothers went to school in Nigeria, coming from America, and unless you are a part of the private school education or went to a British international school, then you were pretty much left to fend for yourself and even drop out.
So affordability of education is a challenge. Walter, I think you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say that you mentioned university education. I think it all begins at the level of primary and secondary school. So I think that, we're working in Morocco on a $450 million compact. One of the main constraints that was identified in the analysis of that compact was youth employability. And what we've seen is that the secondary school system and the primary school system have failed to provide an enabling environment to help today's youth actually come out of school with critical thinking, in a safe environment where they could flourish and develop soft skills that would enable them to better integrate into companies today. So I think the focus on secondary school education is quite important, and we're working on that in Morocco. The other thing that we've seen is that the alignment of vocational training centers to the actual needs of the private sector have been lacking. So I think a lot of vocational training centers that we've seen in Morocco, and I think it probably is the same in other countries as well in Africa, have been developed based on a poor assessment of where the real demand in the private sector was for that talent. And what we've seen as well is that the government-run or the state-run vocational training programs, which are highly subsidized, fail to include the private sector in the design of the programs, in the development of the curriculum, and in the governance oversight. And we're working on that in order to come up with a new model, which is proving to be more successful, I think, than sort of a siloed government-run vocational training center. So getting the private sector involved as well in vocational training is very important.
I think from my point of view, coming from a different background, which is having my undergrad from a French university, having my grad from an Anglophone, basically within the same country in Canada, having lectured also in some business school in Senegal, I can tell that one of the main problems in terms of education that we are having in terms of youth employment is we are not well prepared. We are not preparing the youth for example, entrepreneurship. If you look at, for example, Senegal or the Francophone market, I remember a year and a half ago when I left IDB at the regional director division to create my own company, everyone thought I was crazy. And I was like, why would you leave this comfortable position to go do your own thing? And I think a year and a half ago, the results have been there. In terms of what we've done, setting up the foundation, empowering the youth and the women's throughout a $400,000 program where we are really supporting throughout the country, youth, not only in terms of financing, but in terms of supporting them through the training and helping them mainly believe in themselves. I think one of the key challenge today we are having with the youth in Africa is mainly in 20 countries, which are the Francophone countries, are really helping them to believe in themselves. I think one of the main challenge is that.
Thank you, and it's a really important point. Some of the divisions around Francophone, Lusophone, Anglophone Africa, and the trends that you see and the impact that might have, different educational systems, platforms, and mechanisms for engaging youth. Chika Umiadi.
I'd like to acknowledge the elephant in the room here. Oftentimes, we are quick to look at, undergrads or graduates, and we say that they're unskilled and they're not going to fare well in the workforce. However, if the private sector and the public sector as well, if we're serious about, really investing in human capital, we will look at investing in undergraduate continuous education from a company perspective as a strategic initiative. And some of the best companies that I know are at their core investing in talent. They understand that schools aren't going to teach students everything they need to know to be successful in school, to be successful in the workforce, and it's up to them to teach and invest in those students that are graduating so that they can be productive for their organization and improve professionally. With some of my companies through Tip Hub, one of the key, even though it is cost intensive up front, we drive one of the key pillars for our companies is focusing on human capital investment. You can't afford that senior developer to build out your project, but taking on a junior developer having the patience to take on a junior developer that may not understand as much, but you hold them a little bit more and you grow them and you mature them into a mid-level or senior level developer. That's just a small example from a startup sense, but organizations, as we continue, are going to have to look at that as a strategic opportunity to grow and develop their talent as soon as they graduate.
Thank you, Chika. Jacqueline, you had a comment?
I'm Jacqueline Lampe. I work for R&W Media, and we work in countries where governments are not always functioning very well. So I think there's another elephant in the room, and that's young people who don't have the opportunity to go to school at all. So we're talking about 1.8 billion young people, of which 90% in emerging countries. It's a huge group, and I really think both public sector and private sector, local governments, but also the international global donor community should really prioritize those young people who don't have those opportunities. And last year we have been investing in focus group discussions with young people in countries in MENA region and Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance Yemen or Burundi, where they're really in difficult situations. And when you ask them what their most important issues are, it's about, of course, love, sex and relationship, but it is also about having opportunities, job opportunities, education. So I think it's about secondary schools, it's about universities, but it is also about the young people who don't get enough education at all.
Thanks for raising that second elephant in the room. So there's the human capital investment, the access to quality education, and there are two people, Jeremy and Fred, who I'd like to comment. So Fred, I know you tapped me to go first, but someone who's innovating in the education space, who's tremendously frustrated about the pace of change, and has stepped up and is trying to disrupt the educational paradigms on the continent. Fred.
Thank you, Eddie. So I'd like to build on Chika's point, really, for us to think about the problem we're trying to solve. And the problem we're trying to solve is that we have a very short period of time, less than 17 years, or I like to count in days, 6,000 days, before we have the largest workforce in the world. And so when you have very limited time, very little resources, you cannot approach the solution in a conventional way. And I think that until we move out of looking at conventional places to solve this, we are going to be sitting here 6,000 days from now with 1 billion people roaming the streets of Africa looking for jobs. And so, for example, I don't even think we should be looking at universities as a solution, because universities are fundamentally built as knowledge enterprises, not as skills enterprises. So if you think at the rankings for universities today, the highest ranked universities are because of the amount of research they've done, the amount of publications they've done. It's not whether they created jobs or entrepreneurs. When Africa has been at its best is when we have not simply try to adopt what has been done by everyone else, but we really looked at our own context, our own situation, and we reimagined solutions for our time, like we did when the mobile phone came to Africa. And in 15 years, we went from, less than 2 million phone lines to 800 million, or whatever it is. We need to do exactly the same thing with education and skills development in Africa. Reimagine, start from scratch, and think about what do we need to do with this context. And that's when we'll find the solutions.
Thanks. Jeremy?
+1. Part of what I wanted to say was actually I want to know what Fred thinks on this. So Fred, thank you. I think that's a really important point, and it actually echoes what I wanted to say. I fear with this conversation that we're labeling this an Africa problem when the reality is the U.S. education system is pretty terrible for most students. Pedagogically, there are huge, gaping, obvious holes. And if our goal is to get to that, then I think we've got a long road ahead of us. On the other hand, if we were to take a step back and think about this through the lens of, are there new ways where we can avoid some of the structural challenges that have been created in developed economy education systems? And I think, in fairness, I think ALU is an excellent example. Then I think that we've got a shot to do something that looks at the largest youth labor force in the world 17 years from now, not as a challenge, but actually as an extraordinary opportunity, because there are major segments of the economy that can't find the talent that they need. And increasingly, things like software development also don't care where someone is physically located. And so in the same way that Southeast Asia was able to leverage manufacturing in order to create a large number of pretty good paying jobs, they had a competitive advantage in the cost of creating manufacturing, and then shipping got to a point where you could actually make that work. The competitive advantage for the continent is that youth population. It is the extraordinary skills, Olumide, that you were talking about. The youth population is an amazing competitive advantage that the world needs. And if we think about ways to connect education directly into employment, more cost effectively, but also more rapidly, as opposed to trying to reinvent traditional systems, I think there's a chance to do something really extraordinary.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, Kim.
I just wanted to kind of look at the problem statement that we're trying to solve. I think there's often a focus on the youth bulge in Africa, and how to solve that problem. I think that what we're trying to do at MCC is really look at it from an economic growth standpoint. So we survey businesses, private sector, and we say that what are your constraints to investment in this country? What are your constraints to building your bottom line? And they say there's not enough skilled labor, there's not enough skilled youth in these countries. And so the perspective is really focused on the businesses and not on the youth. But we're saying that if you look at economic growth is an imperative for these countries to get out of their poverty trap, how are they going to do that? They need to unleash those binding constraints to growth, and they really need to focus on what we can do to do something in an urgent way. And I agree with Fred that there is a sense of urgency. We need to be disruptive. We can't follow the traditional models, because I don't think that Africa can wait 10, 20, 30 years to increase their GDPs by incrementally 3 to 5% every year. I do think that we have to do something that is a little more radical and outside the box to really address this issue.
Thank you, Kim. I'd like to move over to Ambassador Thomas Greenfield. I know you had some thoughts, burning thoughts on this question.
I don't know that they're burning.
Yes.
And please call me Linda.
All right, Linda.
Fred raised something in my mind as he was talking about the 6,000 days and the billions of young people who will be looking for jobs. My fear, and this is kind of a third elephant in the room, is that these young people will not be looking for jobs. They will be hopeless and not vested in their countries, and they will be easy fodder for criminal and terrorist elements that could destroy all of our countries. They will be the young people who will continue to take the boats across the Mediterranean into Europe and find other means to go into other countries seeking the opportunities that they can't find in Africa. So I see this as a double-edged sword. The one side of that sword is the tremendous power and entrepreneurship and future that we see in this youth community. But the other side of that double-edged sword is that these youth might just decide to not be part of the global community and not be part of the entrepreneurship and the spirit that we see in terms of Africa's future. And if that happens, we don't just have an Africa problem, we have a global problem that needs to be addressed. And I think this is something that has to be discussed more broadly in the context of our multilateral discussions on how we address these issues, how do we make migration into something that's more organized and less dangerous? How do we make migrants into people who are desired and not pushed away from other countries? Because as we look at countries in the first world, we know those countries need employment. We look at the aging populations in Europe and an increasing aging population in the United States. So where will the workforce come from for all of our countries? It's going to come from this tsunami of young people who we will see on the job market 17 years from now, or 6,000 days, as Fred told us.
Thank you, Linda, for drawing attention to some of the urgent risks that lie ahead with regard to the socio-economic and socio-political instability and risks where you have a population of disillusioned, disenfranchised youth who feel like they have no options. In fact, I was in an Uber not too long ago with a young Nigerian driver, and I asked him how he was doing. And he told me not so well. And I asked him why. And he said there's a young cousin of his in Nigeria who felt so hopeless that they were exploring the prospect of joining one of these radical groups as a source for a few dollars here or there, just to put food on the table.
I see those as employment agencies in a sense.
Yeah, and so President Obasanjo, if you would be so kind to share some of your thoughts on this question.
Thank you very much, Eddie. I was, is it inspired or really brought up to join you, Linda, in what you said. I think earlier on somebody was saying, look, this is the problem, not so much of government, but of private sector. I think this is the problem of all of us. And it's not just the problem of education at the primary level, at the secondary level, at the university level. I think it was Jacqueline who brought out the problem of those that do not have education at all. So there are 4 levels. Level of those who have no education at all. And when we talk of youth employment and youth entrepreneurship, what employment can you give a man or a woman who has no education at all? He cannot even improve on his own or her own life. He cannot make meaningful contribution to better his or her life, let alone make contribution to his family, to his community, to his nation, or in fact to the world at large. And there are more than 10 million of such people in Africa today. Now, we have more people not educated in Africa today than we had at independence because the population has ballooned. At the factor of increase of population from 1960 to today is about 5 in every African country. Nigeria, at independence, we were about 45 million. Today, we are about 200 million. And that is what you have in almost every country, except Niger Republic, which has increased its population by a factor of 10. Not a factor of 5, but a factor of 10. And by the year 2045, every country again will have increased by a factor of 2 to 3, which will bring us to well over 2 billion. Now, the point is that if 10 million university graduates are being turned out every year, and we can only create 3 million jobs, now that is a problem in itself. Now, if we have transition from secondary school to tertiary, which is not more than 30%, that is another problem in itself. Now, where do we get the solution from? Solution will not come from heaven. It will have to come from ourselves. What appears to me is, one, we do not train or we do not educate all our people as we should educate them. Let me take Nigeria. I was looking at this the other day. We have 6 geopolitical states or regions, 3 in the north, 3 in the south. None of the 3 in the south that has less than 93.5% educated. In the northeast, where Boko Haram is rife, and Linda, coming to your point, the percentage is 53%. And for girls, education is less than 40%. And therefore, nobody needs to tell you that one of the causes of Boko Haram is the fact that the level of education in the Northeast is low. And the less the level of education, the more the problem of insurgency, problem of dissatisfaction and frustrated youth. And in that case, we all in Africa are sitting on a keg of gunpowder, all of us. But then it will go beyond Africa, and that is the point you are making. It will go beyond Africa. When those who make attempts to go over the Sahara and cross the Mediterranean have failed, they will come back. And when they come back, they will unleash their anger on their leaders. And not just the political leaders. All of us who are seen as leaders who had not, or who had made their life miserable, will be victims of their anger and their frustration. Now, what can we do about that? And I believe we are already getting late. You are talking of how many days? 600?
6,000 days.
6,000 days. Now, if we are waiting for 6,000 days, well, I don't know. If I want to be a bit irresponsible, I will say in 6,000 days I'll be gone. But that will not be the answer.
Right.
What should we have been done? What should we have been doing that we haven't done? And what do we have to do now?
Yeah.
So that when the 6,000 days come, we are where we should be, not either under the ground or we are being borne by the anger and frustration of our youth.
Thank you, Mr. Obasanjo, for those very poignant words that elevate the urgency of the matter. There's several individuals who've requested the opportunity to say something. Eric, then Okendo, and Uzo. And then we'll come to you, Sandy, sir.
Thank you for having me, first of all. After listening, everyone has something so important to contribute, and it's throwing me off because I have a train of thought and I'm like, I have a point here, and then you say something and then I'm like over there with you. But my main thing is to agree with Jacqueline, first of all. There's a whole generation, a young generation that's actually not being educated, and that's where it has to start. Then we have to change the mindset. So like we've spoken about universities and high school education, but that mindset is what is leading young people in Africa, for Uganda specifically. So I don't want to speak generally because I don't know anything about other places. Well, I know a little bit, but not as much as I should. So in Uganda, for instance, a lot of young people get educated or receive some form of education and end up moving to the cities and leaving what they actually know, like what their parents know, which is agriculture. So if you change that mindset that agriculture is not a place where, you know, peasants live and peasants dwell, and you start viewing it as a business, and you're changing that mindset from a young age, I feel like that will be a very important entry level into changing the way entrepreneurship, employment, and everything on our continent happens. So like what, I don't want to plug myself, but what we're doing right now is we work with young people. They go through a 6-month curriculum which teaches health, hygiene, sexual education, entrepreneurship, financial literacy, and this is all built on the backbone of agriculture. And we link them directly to the private sector, which is us. So it provides them with income as they're learning. So this immediately changes your mindset, and you know that if I do this, I have this opportunity to actually make money. So I feel like, mindset change and young education on things that people actually know is, the first step. Yeah, thank you.
And it is commendable what you're doing, getting young women to have a passion for agriculture by cultivating passion fruit, which is
hashtag
I like
passion
the double
for passion.
entendre. Yeah. Okendo, please. I know you wanted to share some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Eddie, and thank you all so very much for the invitation. I guess I just do want to underscore what I think is important for all of us to keep in mind, that I do genuinely believe that if we are to succeed with this rendezvous with destiny 6,000 days from now, we must keep in mind that there will be no sustainable development across Africa without disruptors. I am a proud graduate of the Literate School in Cambridge, and as great as we think that is, what we know is that if we were to build 200 Harvard-sized universities each year for the next 15 years, it would still not suffice to meet the educational needs across the continent. And so we cannot simply think about education in traditional form. We must think of new ways to deliver education, to deliver healthcare, to deliver just about any product you can think about. And if we are to do that, we are absolutely at the mercy of these disruptors. And I think it is in this context, the work that Fred is doing, the work that Andela is doing, is incredibly important to our collective success. The good news, though, from our perspective, as the founder of Harambee, and as someone who has spent a decade working with young African innovators, is that this is not entirely new to us. we have done this before. I like to remind people that it took the banking system in Kenya 115 years to develop 1,000 branches in ATMs. It took M-Pesa 5 years to connect 19 million people. And so for those who wonder whether we can do this, well, the answer, as the guy from Chicago would tell us, is yes, we can. And that's why I think we must be optimistic about the road ahead, yet we must not lose sight of the fact that if we are going to succeed in this rendezvous with destiny 6,000 days from now, we must bet the house on the disruptors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okendo Uzo, please.
Sure. Thank you guys for having me here. I wanted to do two things. One was first talk about the connection of education and extremism. And while I know it is important to recognize that there is a connection, I think let's not make too much of it because it's not the actual main thing that drives people towards extremist behavior. And I think sometimes you sell like young people short if you assume that the uneducated person is automatically a violent person. In actuality, I think it's more likely that people's grievances towards government and also religious orientation or economic conditions are more likely to drive people to extremist behavior than it is their educational orientation. So I just want to put that out there so that we're not sort of like wholesale condemning a bunch of people who don't have access to opportunity to the investment of history. I think the second thing that I want to bring up and I want to ask is, you know, often with these discussions, you know, I think it's great. We all talk about skills development, entrepreneurship, and whatnot. But I think the core question for me often comes down to what exactly are we educating people for? And when I ask that, I don't mean jobs, because you can tell me jobs all day long. I mean, so what are you expecting people to do? What are the challenges that they're supposed to face? Because if it's just to give someone a job, like they've done that before. The universities that were created in some sense, the educational system in our countries were created to create people who are not necessarily thinkers, but doers or administrators, right? Which is why we have a lot of the problems that we have. So if we're here saying that we're just going to create, you know, a whole bunch of automatons, essentially, you know, in terms of the next generation, people who can just work and support a system that we all have to acknowledge here is going out of style. Like the way that we've educated people, the systems that we've put together to produce in the economies that we have, these are all sort of yesterday's news and in a very, what will be a very detrimental way to the world in which we live. And so if you're just saying we're going to turn out a bunch of people who have education to do jobs that have essentially destroyed the planet that we live on or not built useful societies, then I don't know that that's really worth it in a sense. That's why I asked, what are we educating people for? And then it goes back to this comment made about sort of like the knowledge creation that universities build. I mean, I happen to think, you know, just to your point, Fred, like that it is essential that you have universities that are creating knowledge. You do need to train a set of people that are thinking, that are telling stories. Otherwise, what are you training people for? You know, like you're just training people to be machines. And as we all know, the machines are coming. We're kind of out of luck, you know? So I want us to keep that question in mind, which is what exactly are we educating people for? And I don't think it should be just for jobs or for work's sake. I think there has to be some other purpose. There has to be some thing that we're all buying into. And I just don't think that simple economic empowerment is enough. But I'm going to be quiet now.
And thank you for raising this question of what is it? What kind of work? What kind of world of work are we training young people for? And you know, this panel is also focused on the question of entrepreneurship. And to what degree is entrepreneurship part of the equation and the content, the learning?
Sorry, real quick. But again, just to go back to the entrepreneurship thing, like entrepreneurship for entrepreneur, like everybody tosses it around. Like, what is an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur is a thinker, somebody who can imagine a different world. And if you have a system that trains people not to imagine, which is the way that we train people, and which is what a lot of this talk about skills development or whatever is about, then you can talk about entrepreneurship all you want, and you're not going to get any. And that's what I think frustrates me a little bit about this discussion, right? Is that an entrepreneur it's not like a goal in life. Like you can't educate somebody to be an entrepreneur. Like an entrepreneur is a thinking person who observes the world around them and sees where things can be can be improved or where there's a different story to tell or whatever. So I think that's where the majority of attention, I think we need to that's where it needs to go, the focus.
And that's an important question for the group. I mean, are we losing sight of what the true problem is if entrepreneurship as a paradigm isn't necessarily a panacea to address the challenges that young people are facing? Edem and Sandiso next.
No, so I think I want to, I share his frustration because I moved back to Africa after training as a surgeon here in the US, wondering 730,000 people die a year in America from what we call iatrogenic diseases that you acquire from the hospital environment itself. And I look at how America leads the world in almost everything from cancer to heart disease to all the what do you call them, the non-communicable diseases. And then I look back in my village in Africa where my grandmother is living, 100 years, and, of course, with the kind of lifestyle that most Africans are engaging now, we're catching up with the non-communicable diseases in addition to the communicable problems we already have. And I used to ask myself, so we have one world where you've got a system in place where everybody is trying to catch up with the 10% of the population of the world and who literally run everything. And then you're trying to get Africa to catch up with that world and provide access all the education and healthcare, et cetera. And we've got enough examples with what's going on with China and other places in the world. And I used to ask myself the same question: at what cost? If we could have everybody producing and consuming, in China like Americans consume, well, it would drive the Earth's regenerative capacity into complete oblivion, and it wouldn't be sustainable. So what are the kind of valuable things we need to be educating ourselves for, and also be encouraging our very explosive population of youth to do in the next, if you like, few decades? And what is the most valuable thing we have? I think I would imagine and agree with him that is the life that we have, and out of that comes the planet itself. So if our education is to train people to just consume, to acquire, to build, and et cetera, and at the end of the day, it basically stifles everything that creates more stressful environments, causes us competing, causes us destroying, using our health to get wealth, and then in the process, when we get older, we use our wealth to try to get back health. I think the world is now caught up in, it's trapped in its own idea for development, in the sense that you've got the rest of the world is at 100, trying to cut back, to, if you like, 25. They want to go more renewable. They want to go more preventive. Africa is at 5. We don't need to go to 100 to try to figure out how we come back to 25. And I guess that's where occasions like this present us the challenge to do what my brother Fred and others are calling the disruptors, to set up new standards for not so much of development, but also empowerment, where the entire value system around the things we put value on is completely changing. Is it to, and I think these necessities create the mother for that kind of invention. What are we putting value on our lives on? Is it in, should we be training more, if you like, dental hygienists, in our communities? Because you can put all of them. You can put nutritionists in almost every community in Africa. They're not going to leave because of the brain drain. They're going to stay. They'll prevent people from, if you like, having the kind of monthly dental checks, or if you like, the nutritional things they need. So they have no need for, they need to work people like us out of a job, so you have more and more people. So it's those kinds of things that we need to put value on, that some of us are interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Aubrey and Ambassador Dwight Bush. Next, yes, Aubrey, please.
Yeah, so I think my point kind of builds on what Uzo was saying, and generally that us sitting in a circle here in New York, planning for education for whatever 6,000 days from now, I mean, the future of work is changing. And I've said before, the future of work in many ways that's changing in the US can be seen already in cities like Lagos. People are used to having side hustles, and now here in this country, a lot of people have side hustles. They're used to making a salary out of different ways of earning income, right? People here are losing benefits that were once tied to their jobs, and people are trying to figure out where the safety net lies. And a lot of the kind of future of work dynamics, the gigified economy, platforms where people are getting their jobs because they're part of an app, whether it's an Uber for cars or Uber for trucks or for all kinds of, for tutors, there's an Uber for tutors. Basically, you can call a tutor on demand in Nigeria. I mean, those things are already existing. So I think we're witnessing a platform economy, and we don't even know the jobs that are going to be needed necessarily for today. And education, I mean, people on the streets all over African markets are learning from YouTube in the same way that you meet people here learning in snippets. There's education that's coming from gamified platforms. My point in saying all of that is that, you know, rebuilding the old and trying to build systems that were hundreds of years old, it's a little bit futile. And we sit here with a degree of arrogance to think we can, you know, centrally plan it of sorts. And the future of work's playing out on the ground.
Thank you, Aubrey. Mr. Bush.
Well, thank you. There was a
Sandiso and Fred, I know you want to respond.
I think this question about where we start is really important, and I think I'm probably biased towards a very Western approach, which is, I think, first about the stability of a country and whether people have a safe place to live and enjoy life and all of its positive manifestations. And I hear a lot of conversation about the importance of higher education and STEM education. And to Jacqueline's point, there are a whole lot of people who need to have basic education, have access to jobs that are fulfilling, vocational jobs. Just like in the United States, we moved away from appreciating people who have vocational skills. If you didn't go to college in the 80s and 90s, somehow you were deficient. And what I'm afraid of is that we get so preoccupied with STEM orientation that we don't create enough jobs for masses. And when I was the ambassador in Morocco and we saw the second Millennium Challenge Compact after the first, which was focused on trades and then an expansion to secondary education, it was because we were thinking about people who want to do things and need to do things with their hands, which are most of the population. And we always thought, to Linda's point, that if you had high youth unemployment and you had access to the internet, all you needed was a charismatic leader or a cause, and things could flip quickly and the stability of countries could be affected. So I start from the point of I want to make sure that as many people as possible have education experiences that allow them to live a good life. And I feel very confident that this group at the top that are the thinkers and the people that reflect and can do creative things, they're going to take care of themselves. But what I'm worried about is you're a common person who no longer appreciates what you can do on a farm, who doesn't appreciate what you can do with a plumbing degree or with a dental hygienist degree, and be able to do some things that contribute.
Thank you, sir. Sandiso, and then John Momo, please.
Hi. So I wanted to just break the youth employment and entrepreneurship topic, which is, for me, youth employment is either a self-employment or employed by someone. And so therefore, entrepreneurship is a type of employment. And the point I want to make is, as been said already, there's a skills gap that we're all facing right now. And I think the skills gap doesn't only lie in people trying to enter the workforce, which you speak about work readiness, but we speak about also entrepreneurs not being enterprise ready. So and many young people are starting to build businesses, create jobs. And my role at Accenture is to identify startups that can actually solve my clients' problems. And the challenge I'm having is that even the entrepreneurs that come to the table are not ready, and that speaks to the education that is provided by universities / incubators and accelerators. And there's a gap in them being enterprise ready. So what does that mean? It means that if a startup has to enter the offices of Accenture today, they should have, their books should be in order, they should have a proper presentation, they should need to tell their problem solving, the problem they're solving must be clearly articulated. They need need to have a basic thing, which is a rate card. So a lot of startups I speak to, by the time they've gone through a number of accelerator programs, they don't have basic things like a rate card. And if we don't prepare our entrepreneurs to actually be enterprise ready and be actually businesses that will actually grow and be able to employ other people, we're sit in a situation whereby we're going to have so many entrepreneurs, so many little businesses in Africa, and a very few unicorns. So really addressing the skills gap on two sides of the coin, really, for self-employment and for employment as well.
Thank you very much, Sandy. So, John, I know you had some comments that you wanted to share.
Absolutely, and thank you. It's good to be here. I just wanted to raise two issues. One, the Northeast that President Obasanjo referred to, and the ticking time bomb, and take it to a different level entirely, and some of the issues that have not been addressed in the northeast of Nigeria at the moment. And secondly, to emphasize the fact that a lot of the entrepreneurs in Africa is actually necessity-driven. People are trying to put body and soul together. And because of that, they get easily frustrated when they start a business and they're not able to sustain it, and then the business dies, and then they're looking for other ways to put body and soul together, and that leads to some of them who are into very micro enterprises seeking the golden field fleece elsewhere, hence the migration to other parts of the world. I think that the government policies could help in this regard. We need policies that will help foreign direct investment so that we can have a good environment and where there can be a lot of jobs to be created through construction, through agriculture, and the like. I think that in the northeast of Nigeria, there's the ticking time bomb also includes the over 200,000 people who are displaced. 40,000 of those are orphans, kids who are orphaned, who by Boko Haram, What's going to happen to them? So many youths who at the end of the day might just go back to be employed by Boko Haram. So indeed, it's a ticking time bomb. And if the government is not able to play its role as it should, the private sector should also come in channels, for instance. What we're trying to do in that region is to try and see how we can begin to help out in looking for people who are between the ages of 16 and 30 who can work as reporters, potential reporters. And what we want to do is to train them. So we set up the Channels Academy to focus also on the northeastern Nigeria to see how we can create a core of reporters for the region and for the country. I think the private sector has a role to play in this regard. And if each organization tries as much as possible to intervene in getting some people into the organization, helping out to train them, then it will be well worth it.
Thank you for drawing more attention to the collaborative nature of the interventions that need to happen. It has to be government, private sector. There's a role for many stakeholders to play in this significant challenge. Fred, I know you really want to respond to some of the things that have been thrown out there regarding entrepreneurship, so please.
Sure. Thank you, Eddie. I want to respond to a couple of things that Uzo mentioned. I think, Uzo, you asked a very good question about why are we even having this discussion? Education, employment for what purpose? In my mind, what we are really talking about is about giving people freedom and dignity. And I think that freedom and dignity is something that all of us as human beings yearn for. And as a continent, for the last 100 years, we've been searching for this in different ways. Right? I think there have been sort of 3 fights that we've been doing. The first fight, which for the first 50 years out of that 100, was a fight for political independence. That was what we were fighting for. We wanted to be free from colonialism, and we won that one. Then it became a fight for peace. There was a lot of decades of, warfares and coups and so forth, and mostly that has also been won. And Africa is largely a peaceful continent. What we are still not free from right now is poverty. And what we're talking about here is giving people enough food in in their stomach, enough, a decent housing, good, education, all the things that we yearn for to see, to live fulfilled lives. It's about giving every African that opportunity. And so you mentioned entrepreneurs in my mind are not thinkers, because entrepreneurs are doers. I think we've been thinking too much in Africa, not doing enough. And the reason why we are where we are is because we're not, doing the hard things that need to be done to actually change. Because many of the solutions that we need are relatively simple. It requires hard things to be done, and one elephant in the room that has not been mentioned is leadership. That's the big, highest level of issues that need to be solved. Because I live on an island called Mauritius. It's a tiny place. They have no resources, no gold, no diamonds, nothing. The unemployment rate there is 3%. If you're looking for a cleaner to clean your house, you can't even find them. This country has over 50 years quietly been peaceful. If you want to open a business there, I was trying to start the first campus of the university in South Africa. Ooh, did I mention that name? Sorry. We had 40 people. 20 of them were stuck outside of South Africa because we couldn't get work permits for them. We flew to Mauritius. They were apologizing to me about the fact that they could no longer get work permits in 3 days. And it was now taking them 2 weeks. There's no foreign exchange controls, peace and security, infrastructure's there. So it's a place you want to go and do business. So what do? People they attract foreign investment. People go and they create jobs. There are many, many jobs to be created in Africa. We have cities to build. 800 million people are moving to cities in the next 40 years. We have all that it takes to be the world's breadbasket in terms of agriculture. And the whole world is growing, and there's no way for them to be fed. Why are we not feeding them? And the jobs that need to be created don't all need education either. Because, for example, there's Harambee in South Africa. They are getting people who have not even finished high school, and they're looking at traits that they have. There's some jobs that just require certain human traits, attention to detail, perseverance, things like that. And they're finding those traits and matching them to jobs that allow them to do that. So many of the things that need to be done are simple, but we're not doing. And we're thinking and we're talking. And we'll be sitting here 6,000 days from now, not having done things, and this thing will not have been solved.
Thank you for the call to action, to quit the talking and engage in more action. So more doing from Fred. And I think you also raise a very important point about the quest for dignity. People want to live a life with respect and dignity, and sometimes the opportunities are not readily available for them to be able to participate in a way that would bring them that dignity. Ronald, I know you had a comment you'd like to make, and I'd also like to move the conversation a little bit to talk about the ecosystem of financing, access to capital, and some of the challenges that's presenting to young people who do want to go into entrepreneurship. Ronald.
Thanks, Eddie. So there's obviously been a lot of elephants thrown into the room, so I'm not going to try and address all of them, but I am going to touch on a lot of different things. So firstly, I agree with most of the points that everyone's made. I think the clear thing is that there are lots of issues to be resolved. It's a massive problem that is quite urgent and needs, some collaborative thinking. And I think the word collaboration is probably the key word in terms of how we get to a point where within 6,000 days, there's a solution to the problem, or at least it's been resolved prior to that. I think, Linda spoke about youth unemployment and no hope, but I think there's also an element of underemployment, which means people are getting paid $2 per day versus, what you would make somewhere else, which would be, a couple of $100 per day. I think that in itself is an issue, and whatever solutions come up have to address that element. I think the primary thing is, I've heard what everyone said, but I think the primary thing is, the clear thing is everyone has an idea of how to fix a particular area. So there's people that run charities. My mother runs a charity. We built an orphanage home in Zimbabwe. We look after like 40 kids. The problem with that, though, is in operating in silos, you're not obviously creating a holistic approach or a holistic solution. And I think the conversation needs to move on to how do we operate as one? I mean, a bit of a Wakanda movement, if you want to call it that, but I think that is the quickest way to get to a solution. If you can get people to collaborate and work together on an African scale. I mean, and the thing with Africa, I mean, Africa is not one country. It is lots of different countries with lots of different languages. So there are lots of barriers to that process. So the thing that I think is important is creating an Africa free trade area and also creating a single market and free movement of people, which is basically EU. I mean, I come from a country that is trying to leave the EU, but I think creating a space where you have almost like centralized government policies and creating ways for countries to trade and also tackle the problems that the continent faces as a group is a much quicker way to get to where, and also just creating an environment where it's possible to trade. It's like what Fred was saying about the difficulty. I mean, I'm in the process of setting up a business in South Africa, and I've had several challenges with that process. So I fully understand what he's saying. The thing that I think is important is to get policies that obviously reflect the intent. And I think, Uzo, with your point about, you know, what's the point? I mean, getting jobs isn't really the only point. So I think this is where Afro Champions comes in as well. So having a movement, in effect, so everyone buys into where we are now and where we're trying to get to is really important. So, and I think the process has to be active and intentional and directed, so it's absolutely clear, which then calls the question of like, well, who's the leader, who's creating the process and moving the process forward. So I would say, in summary, because I've said a lot of things, but I would say in summary, I think it's important, so all the things that we've touched on in terms of youth unemployment, job creation, even things like microfinancing, financing, all of those things are much easier done if they're done together, but it's bringing the right people into the room and making sure that happens. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for drawing, the point around systems, ecosystems, and how collaboratively people can work in tandem. Harmonization of policies and processes, regional institutions that can participate in streamlining these things. It's interesting that now, as a lot of the West is starting to look more inward, the African continent is looking regionally to integrate. So there are opportunities there. Nuala and Candice. Nuala first.
It was very interesting to listen to all your...
Red, the middle, yeah.
Yes, hi. Hi, I'm Noella. I think it was very interesting to listen to all your points, but coming from Congo, having a war, economical war since more than 20 years, I think it's very, very key for the development of Africa that we have peace. And Congo, a country worth 24 trillion of minerals and people living under $1 a day, where villages are being destroyed, where villages are not being educated, where there's no school in villages, is very important. I do believe, and my foundation is really focused on village development and for education and health program for communities. It's very important that we can give jobs to the youth. We can transform the minerals in our country. We can transform more minerals in our continent. Our minerals in the Congo are living, most of them, brute. What you have in your phone, in your laptop, in your iPad, in your green card, with coltan, cobalt, lithium, all of that. And it's very important as African. Congo, as long as there's no peace, is destabilizing all the Sub-Saharan African countries. So we need in the next few years to fulfill a generation where we develop peace, where we're giving jobs, where we give them knowledge of the wealth they're sitting on, not only in terms of minerals, in terms of agriculture, and educating the voice of women. The half work women have, and girls' education are very key. A woman education, she will invest in a family, in a community, in a country, and have a global voice. we are in minority here on this table, women, but and in government and different key jobs in Africa, and that's something that I do believe. Then we need to take more a bigger role for the development of Africa and have a place in the job and the private sector.
Thank you, Noella, for drawing our attention to peace and stability as a fundamental piece, but also gender equity and the inclusion for young women and those impoverished those excluded at the margins of poverty, the extreme margins of poverty. Candice?
So I want to draw on the topic of collaboration, because I think that we all have a lot to collaborate on. We're at an incredible intersection as Thomson Reuters with regard to leveraging data and looking at how companies actually have a lot to do with helping frame this youth employment and entrepreneurship challenge. And I think to Fred's point, we've got 6,000 days, and I think that we all probably need to leave this room with having probably committed something individually and collaboratively to the next 6,000 days. Companies are doing a lot in silos. So from our experience, we are at an incredible intersection of working with various corporations, and a number of them are present here at the Concordia Summit and at Unga Week. And I feel like there are so many opportunities for companies to share more and trust each other more to solve this challenge together. So, Sandiso, you talked about your Accenture opportunities from an innovation space. We've been doing very similar work as well from a continental perspective, and I think there are incredible opportunities to be able to connect the dots, both from a data perspective in terms of helping people articulate what they're sitting on and work with them on finding that place of collaboration in order to solve the challenges. And then the second point that really resonated with me was your narrative around Uganda and agriculture. And I think that as society, we put stigmas on certain jobs. And I'm hugely excited about your particular message, because I think you're reframing that for people. And I think we cannot underestimate how much sharing goes on when you have helped support a community in a specific region. So your message for me talked to the fact that we're setting up ecosystem hubs and a lot of the incubation hubs in all the cities that we visit when we travel to Africa, but what about the townships and the areas surrounding that, and exposing people to what those opportunities are in those areas? So.
Thank you very much, Candice. So if the next round of speakers could speak a little bit to the question of capital and access to financing. Samba, and I know, Jacqueline, you have a comment to make, but Samba and Mustafa.
Thank you. Traveling in Africa for the past 25 years, visiting more than 40 countries, I'm asking myself some question. Are we African, we want really to develop? Because sometimes I see things that I cannot understand, because we have all the ingredients to develop this continent. Today we're talking about job creation, education, agriculture, all that. How can we do all that if we are not united? We don't have the same vision, because we have the same problem. The problem of this continent is what? We don't have the basic infrastructure. The basic infrastructure today, for me, is what? We need to integrate our economy. We're talking about political integration that will never happen if we don't do the economic integration. The economic integration is what? Today, somebody was talking about Congo, where you have a lot of land, where you could do a lot of irrigation. We could produce millions of tons of product. How can you sell it on the market in Senegal? Because there is no transport. Where we need to fight today as African, and this is something do or die is to come together to decide to integrate our infrastructure. We need to build railway from Djibouti to Dakar, from Johannesburg to Algeria. And we're not talking about big amount. We're talking about 300 billion US dollar to connect the continent from north to south and from east to west, where I'm going to give you a simple, I have a study where we could take a container from Djibouti to Dakar port at the cost of $600, where today a container from Bamako to Dakar is $3,000. 6,800 kilometers versus 1,400 kilometers. You see the difference, how agriculture can develop. So one thing we need to do today is to come together. We're talking about only $30 billion every year to do those massive integration projects. First, railway, and railway will power it with energy. We have Inga in Congo that can produce 100,000 megawatts. Today, with ultra-high network voltage, we can take energy from 4,000 kilometers. China, they did it from east to west. Why cannot we do it? And the cost of the energy will go down to 7 cents, where most of our country are paying 20 cents. Do you see? Only the economy will gonna do that can repay for those investments. So we're talking about $80 billion to power this train, because this is already commercial. And the excess will give energy to hundreds of millions of people around those corridors. So I'm asking myself, are our leaders, did they really want to develop Africa? Before even we talk to the foreign world, we need first to decide to jointly work together. We take countries who have a competitive advantage for energy, let's use them as energy corridor. Some who have a competitive advantage for agriculture, let's use them as agriculture corridor. Some countries who have a competitive advantage for industry, let's use them as industry corridor. Let's stop thinking about selfish, each country trying to do something that never works. So that's the only way that will create millions of jobs. That youth employment that we're talking about. The day we decide to this Marshall Plan to do all those big projects, massive projects, millions of jobs will be created. And then job will be created, there will be peace. We're talking about peace, whatever. Peace will never come if people don't have job. Yep. So that's the problem we need to fix before anything.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to call on the folks who haven't spoken yet, but Mustafa, I know you wanted to add a comment here.
I think we need to bring the conversation to a level where, you know, we could really tap into the reality in Africa. I mean, we talk about jobs, we talk about entrepreneurship, but have we defined really the reason why youth in Africa want a job? If, you know, I've lived almost 13 years in Canada, and the reason why I wanted the job when I was in Canada is because I need to pay my rent, I need to pay my bills. In Africa, youth want a job, not because they need to pay their rent, but because they have to feed their family. Most of the time, they're parents. Initially, they are fathers and mothers, because most of the time they rely, you know, on these kids to support them. When I set up my foundation a year and a half ago, and we were trying to see what we really wanted to do in order to make a difference, because as Fred was saying, time is flying. We have a concern. We need to be really creative. When we set up the foundation, we're looking at two pillars. What can we do with women, and what can we do with youth? We've, you know, traveled across the country, and we realized that one thing that we have experienced with women, we found that women are so organized, and I'm so amazed why we cannot learn from them. Women are so well organized. I've went to Kaulak, which is, you know, the region where I was born, and trying to see what we can do really to make a difference. And we realized that there were around 2,000 group of women in the country, and each of them were between 50 to 100. exceptionally some were 400 to 600. These women, what they'll do is every Sunday they gather in front of one house where they'll do what we call tontine. So each one can, participate for 10 cents, 20 cents, and etc. So if you're looking at their savings, it's range from $500 to the maximum was around 6 million is around $10,000. These are what they have, and every Sunday they need to gather and like other financing, each one can benefit from $25 to basically $100. And in a month and a half, they could generate even 3 times the amount of money that you provided to them. Well, we met those women, we found out that their problems were the financing. They would gather, they have little amount of money. We injected between $50 to $3,000, identifying 5,807 women that have access to these financings. So we injected $40,000 to finance them. The idea was we give them 10 months for them to basically repay the loan. In 3 months, all of them have decided to pay the loan. So when we do the survey with them, in 3 months, they have made 3 times the amount of money that we provided to them. Okay? We said, okay, let's emulate this with the youth. To be honest with you, it has been almost 2 months and a half now. With the women, the minute we identified their need, it took us less than 3 weeks to organize them, to finance them, and everything was okay. But we wanted to do the same thing for the youth. It has been almost 2 months and a half now that the fund is there, but we cannot help the youth organize themselves the way the women they organize themselves, so we can provide the financing to them. Okay? The idea for me is, as I said, in Africa, sometimes we tend to go look solutions that could work in other countries, just we want to copy and paste. And if we look at the reality from a very basic point, we can see that our realities are different. And if we look at a closer look of what we really wanted to do, I think there is a huge difference that we could do. These women that we have financed, just for an example, I'm just gonna leave it there. 123 households now in that regions are able to have 3 meals a day, and they couldn't have these 3 meals a day. Imagine with $40,000 that you provided financing to 5,807 women. Now 123 households now are able to manage 3 meals a day. All we need to do is just to copy that from our own countries and paste on the youth, and it will work. That's what I wanted to share with you as an example.
Thank you for citing an example of a homegrown solution that you have encountered. Jacqueline Funlola, you had a comment, and then I believe Walter, you wanted to say something. And Chika, okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to freedom and dignity, the agency of young people to take their own decisions, and that's really important. And I wanted to share a very basic example in Burundi. We work with a bloggers network in Burundi. It's informally organized, both young boys and young women, and they operate very carefully in that context. Which is currently a very difficult context. And they can only push so far to be able to remain active. So young people in Burundi express the ambition to start small businesses. But the fee for starting small businesses was getting more and more difficult to pay. So what our bloggers network did was organize a very basic offline dialogue, and they invited the Burundi governance agency for investment. And that was their way of changing the fees, changing their situation, and therefore taking the opportunity to start their own businesses. So that's the agency of young people, I think, is something we should add as well.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for that illustration. Von Lola, please, brief comment.
So I know we're running out of time, so I'll be brief. One comment that was speaking to me is that when we think about entrepreneurship, people have images of glassy offices in Silicon Valley, but all over Africa, the agege or bread seller is an entrepreneur. The tailor is an entrepreneur. So for a lot of these solutions, it won't reach those people. And while Fred talks about 6,000 days, there is a community of people, whether it's in the rural regions or in the urban regions, that need help today. And particularly to your financing question, I mean, we can look to Western foundations, or we can look to Asia, or we can look to impact investors, but there's a significant community in Africa which has not been tapped, and it's the wealthy who are on the continent. I mean, they are the ones who can build and broker those trust networks that can invest in these SMEs, that can empower these entrepreneurs to create growth. Here in the US, we know that it's not government that provides the most jobs, or it's not large corporations, it's small to medium-sized enterprises. And unless we empower those, then the whole question of youth employment will still continue to evade us.
Chika, Sandiso really wants to jump in as well, and wow, we might go a little bit over. Yes, go ahead, keep it brief, please.
I'll try. I think when I was going to talk about access to finance, but I think in the spirit of entrepreneurship, one of the last elephants in the room is that entrepreneurship really needs to start from a government's perspective, right? How can we get government to be more entrepreneurial in their thinking, especially when attacking problems like youth employment and education? At the end of the day, we don't necessarily, once again, I'm not condoning like looking to the West for every solution, but we have, from a global perspective, we have examples and models from all over the world that we can use to look at how countries have looked at these problems and come up with solutions, especially around education and youth unemployment. And I would emphasize that we really need to get leaders in the space, leaders in government to start thinking about how can we get things done quickly, how can we get things done efficiently, how do we use some of the lean startup models that we talk about in startup world, how do we talk about lean governance, and how do we talk about using those kind of practices to really drive outcomes for their population.
Diso, please.
So as Accenture and United Nations Development Programs, we've built a platform called YES, Youth for Africa and SDGs. And really what we're trying to do there is firstly educate entrepreneurs. So we partner with Bertha Center in Cape Town to actually provide us relevant learning content from an Africa perspective. Because when you speak about learning content, when you go to the internet, everything is like American Silicon Valley. So we need to build our own Africa relevant content. And then we also looked at funding entrepreneurs, and we just did a test of trying to give entrepreneurs very small money, $5,000, between $5,000 and $10,000. And just to speak to the gender equality challenge we're having is out of all the applicants that we have, about only 5% of them are actually women applicants. And I'm not sure what the problem is. Women just don't want to apply for these programs. And I mean, I use my own personal abilities to also share the word that we have grant money, but to the table, the men are only coming to the table. And I'm South Africans, I don't know what's happening in other countries, but what I can say is that so long as we don't address this gender equality issue, we speak to also people not being able to get educated, because we know that women spend most of their income towards the family, so giving their kids better education. But if men are the ones that are still going to be the money makers, we run the risk of having no women actually educated or even being business people.
Thanks, Andiso, for highlighting some of the projects you've worked on, but also the gender equity piece. Jeremy, and then we'll have Olumide and Mamadou.
Thanks, Eddie. I appreciate a lot of the comments that have been made, but I worry that we're overcomplicating a handful of things. Uzo, I understand that pure economics are not a perfect way to look at outcomes from an education standpoint, but as anyone who's run large organizations would probably point out, you do need a scoreboard to create direction. And I love Fred's notion of dignity and respect. I think of it in a similar, I think, way of just education is preparing someone for the world, to be able to engage with the world in a productive way. And in doing that, the closer you can bring education to the economic outcomes for the learner, the better off you are. For Andela, the average person accepted into Andela is earning under $4,000 a year. They pay 0 tuition over a 4-year period, earn income, and exit earning, on average, over $40,000 a year. If you can mass produce 10x income increases, and you can do that across multiple countries with thousands of people, all of a sudden ecosystems build up around that. But you need to look at it in a very straightforward, what can we do to improve economic outcomes? And I don't think we can tell people what they should or shouldn't do with their time. We can create a platform that gives them the choice to say, I have an opportunity to do it myself. And if we use first principles to look at this and say, how do we just figure out how to improve people's economic outcomes? They, on their own, will find lots of other ways to leverage that education. We can't tell them what to do, but we can create that platform.
Thank you, Jeremy. Olumide and Mamadou, if you could keep it brief, and we can wrap up soon. Thank you.
Okay, Funlola talked about necessity-driven entrepreneurship, the agege bread seller. I work with a lot of people like that, and a lot of people in Africa, in Nigeria particularly, are self-employed because that's the necessary thing. They need to survive, and they do all sorts of things, some of which are not documented. So for such people, the skills they need are very basic, how they can grow their businesses, how they can save better, how they can access funds, very simple funds, and stuff like that. And I think that if we can create more programs that target such people, we will achieve a lot, because that's a very huge majority of people. Also, the concept of dignity and recognition. I think that maybe that's one of the reasons why I keep talking about young people. If there is anything that young people do not have in Africa, it is dignity. The dignity, the recognition. Our systems are not centered, they're centered around the older folks, such that young people do not have that. And I think that that's a concept that we need to encourage. There are ways we can do that. We should give young people seats at the table, at all our tables. You know, we should give young people the chance to participate in things on the national level. Our national awards in Nigeria, for example, are not meant for young people. Young people are never invited to things like that. It's very rare. Now, the Queen of England set up something called the Queen's Young Leaders Program, targeting very young people from Africa. And I think it is a shame that it should be the Queen of England that will find talent in Africa and take it to, and bring them to England. I think it's a shame. I know a number of people who have received such. I know people who have benefited from the Mandela Washington Fellowship as well. And such things are initiatives that have come from the West. By the way, those initiatives are also training the disruptors that Fred talked about. And just by the way, Fred is doing an incredible work at ALA and ALU. It's something like that. He's also training the disruptors. So I think that we need to give young people a seat at the table. I don't want to take too much of our time, but there's a conference that we do, the Twin Institute Annual Conference. And earlier this year, we had over 2,500 people in attendance. Our publicity budget was less than $1,000. You know why? Because what we did was we brought out young people. I went on radio and I told people their profiles. And a lot of Nigerians were surprised that there were young people who were doing such amazing stuff that they had never heard about. And people came to listen to them and to learn entrepreneurship from them. 2,500 people. So we need to give dignity and recognition to young people. Lastly, the processes, the chain. I think that, so for a sector like Nollywood has incredible potential, but it is performing far below its potential. I think that one of the reasons is funding, but it's not just funding. I think it's also about the chain itself. There is piracy, and there are things like that. The government is not really putting in what is not really living to its, is not contributing what it should to that sector. And if we can fix stuff like that, we would, so like our music video industry is very advanced in Nigeria. It's probably much more advanced than our movie industry. We spend far more on music videos that are going to be 5 minutes than we spend on movies that are going to be 2 hours. That shows that the problem is not really about capital. The problem is more about the chain. When they produce these movies are going to be pirated. So there's no need, they don't want to produce more. Okay, so I've taken a lot of time. Anyway, my point is that we need to give young people a seat at the table, and we need to look at some of those processes that make it difficult for people like me to want to stay in Africa and run our businesses. We need to look at those things because it really is difficult. My parents keep telling me to move over to the US or move to Europe or somewhere like that. And I think the last point goes to African media. I think that African media can do a lot to give people recognition. There was an article written on Forbes about my work, and that article changed my story. We don't do that in Africa. I mean, our media are telling the wrong stories.
You have to pay.
They are talking about politicians all the time. We need to start talking about the young people who are doing stuff. So
you have to pay.
We're talking about Yali all the time and African future leaders.
Thank you very much, Olumide, for your passion, for your energy, for your commitment.
More voice to women and girls, okay?
To the issues that you're working on. A last comment. I know you kicked us off. Maybe you can close us out as well, Mamadou.
No, yeah, I just wanted to contribute some practical aspects, I think, in this. I think that I agree with many of the comments that were made, but I would like to come back to the centrality of skills. I think that what you talk, dignity, place at the table is very important. But having run a program called Digital Jobs Africa, which in 2 years actually trained 150,000 young people and directly placed 50,000 young people in jobs. What we have learned is that actually out of those 50,000, about 20% actually transitioned from those entry-level jobs that they have been placed in, because they use their income actually to save and invest in businesses that they transition to go to run. So some of these entry-level jobs are not the dream job of anybody. But what is important is actually not training the young people for specific jobs, but really giving them actually the skills that are transferable to different jobs. And so that, as you said, they can have the confidence, the agency that would allow them actually to navigate the space, to create. We have seen some of them that actually invested, created their own businesses, and hired other people based on that. So this is really practical from lessons that we have seen, and I think that really we need to have more of those youth-centric programs that actually empowers them and give them the opportunity to navigate a changing workspace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mamadou. And something that has been reiterated here several times is how do we make sure that the interests, the values, the interests, the needs, and the concerns of young people are centrally located in policy formulation, in the action that's taken by governments, by private sector, by civil society, and our organizations, many of you working among them, to transform change on the continent that is relevant and addresses the challenges and needs of young people in Africa. I am hopeful. I remain hopeful that there are opportunities to move the needle, but it's an urgent problem. Fred always cites the 6,000-day question. We all know we are connected to young people around the continent, either through our extended networks, the urgency and the challenges of the needs. So I thank you for starting this conversation. There is no silver bullet, but we have to come together and work collaboratively to address the challenges. Thank you very much for participating in this roundtable, and we shall now conclude the session.